We can all name some American movies about the Vietnam War, but can you name at least a single one that was made in Vietnam? History is usually written by the winners, but somehow the Vietnamese perspective has been neglected in the West for the most part, especially the way it's been told in Vietnamese cinema. I chose 3 films about their point of view on the Vietnam War, which also show how it evolved over time. But I have some criteria. Number 1, I only chose films made in North Vietnam and modern-day Vietnam. Even if South Vietnam had its own film industry too before the country collapsed, it's a separate topic. Films made by Vietnamese filmmakers abroad are also excluded. And number 2, in this video I'm considering the films where only Americans are the main antagonists, not the South Vietnamese army. Girl from Hanoi was one of the last films made in North Vietnam before North and South reunified under one country in 1976. What I was immediately surprised by is how intimate the overall story feels. It's set during the Christmas bombings of 1972, a bombing campaign also known as Operation Linebacker 2. It was approved by President Richard Nixon under Henry Kissinger's advice in order to force the North Vietnamese to resume peace talks, which had stalled by that point. This resulted in 12 days and nights of heavy bombing in the areas of Hanoi and Hai Phong. It was one of the harshest bombing campaigns in the war. During these events in the movie, we follow a little girl looking for her family after having lost track of them in the chaos of the bombings. A major element in this movie is the constant back and forth between the life of the girl before and after the bombings, which is very effective at portraying the devastating effect of this event. What's even more surprising is that Americans appear only in one scene when they're walked through the streets after having been captured. But instead of mobbing them like everyone else, the girl just stares at them in contempt. The anger for the war and the bombings in this movie is not directed primarily at the soldiers themselves. Instead, the real villains everyone talks about are Nixon and his government. The Americans only reappear again in the movie in the form of B-52 bombers, making the enemy feel more detached than if they were just regular American soldiers. North Vietnamese filmmakers were working with very strict technical limitations at the time due to a lack of resources because of the war. But instead of hurting the creative outcome of this movie, these restrictions are used to the movie's advantage. First of all, rather than trying to make a blockbuster, the director chose to portray a more personal view of the war. The perspective of the innocent people who suffer because of it takes center stage. Even when fighting is shown, it's not really a reenactment of those events, because from the quality of the footage it looks like real archive footage of bombings and planes crashing down. What I found especially original was that there's even an animated segment in the movie. It has very limited animation, but it makes a fairy tale that the girl's father tells her that much more compelling. The abandoned field-free fire zone was made after the reunification of Vietnam. This one takes place on the Mekong Delta, which is in the south, but it's about a family trying to survive in a free fire zone while also engaging in guerrilla fighting. Basically, in such areas, anything that moved would be shot at, which was meant to facilitate the fight against the Viet Cong, or communist partisans that were hard to distinguish from civilians. Just like Girl from Hanoi, this movie is also centered around regular people just trying to get on with their lives, which are constantly disrupted by the war. The family shown in this story was the only one that refused to leave the free fire zone, managing to stay unnoticed when all the others who lived there were displaced to a safer area. There are many scenes from their daily lives, showing them in harmony with their environment and extremely knowledgeable about surviving in it, in contrast with the Americans who are not used to the area and always patrol it by helicopter. Even when one American soldier tries to set foot in the zone, he immediately gets scared by the first snake that comes his way. And the life the Americans lead back at the base is shown as very comfortable compared to the Vietnamese family. From a visual standpoint, I'm used to seeing the war from the relative safety of American helicopters, but here we see what it's like to be hiding from one on the ground. That's inspired by the director's own experience in the war, who vividly remembered how terrifying it was to see the helicopters lowering themselves so close to him. Another visually unique aspect about this film is that the jungle is shown in black and white. It was probably the only option they had, but not seeing the luscious green colors of the Vietnamese jungle made me feel closer to the place and the characters. The Americans have a much more significant presence in this story than they did in Girl from Hanoi. Even if they're portrayed in a stereotypical way to a certain extent, they're shown as regular people with their own families back home. And the way they treat their job is also very methodical and not done out of pure spite towards the Vietnamese. It's also interesting that the Americans are portrayed by Vietnamese actors, except for Robert Thuy. He was a French-Italian man who grew up in Vietnam and was often cast as an American in Vietnamese movies at the time. Hanoi 12 Days and Nights is the last movie I want to discuss. Just like Girl from Hanoi, this one is also set during the Christmas bombings of 1972, but it was made almost 30 years after those events. This is the only movie on my list that doesn't focus on a specific character. Instead, there's an ensemble cast of characters and none of them seems to be the protagonist. The movie feels like it wants to teach the new generation about the war and emphasize the communal effort of Vietnamese people uniting for their country. There's a lot of exposition about the historical context of the story, which they try to make more compelling with a few action-packed scenes throughout the movie. I struggled to focus on the characters compared to the intimate portrayal of the ones in Girl from Hanoi or Abandoned Field. Hanoi 12 Days and Nights tries to be a blockbuster in an effort to appeal to a wider audience, since the film industry wasn't subsidized by the government anymore like it used to be. But the movie flopped anyway, bankrupting the production company behind it. Americans here are now played by white guys, but they're not necessarily Americans as you can hear by their Australian accents.
Let's beat the hell out of them and get them back to the table in Paris.
Just like the way Americans were shown in Abandoned Field, this time when they're discussing the plan of attack, they're very methodical and just focus on their strategy. But when some of the pilots get captured, we don't see how they're treated in prison. They're shown as ashamed of their actions and grateful for their treatment as POWs, which actually felt a bit like they had a gun pointed at their head the whole time. But even during combat, the emphasis is not so much on the pilots that fly the B-52 bombers, but the ability of the Vietnamese to fight off such a technologically advanced enemy with limited resources. Overall, the general sentiment in these three movies is not really about spewing anger at the United States for their role in the war, but rather about rebuilding the country instead of focusing on past resentments. The main focus in these stories is usually put on regular Vietnamese civilians, rather than the fighting itself. And interestingly enough, in earlier movies like Girl from Hanoi, women have a central role in these stories. Even in Abandoned Field, the way the mother takes revenge for her husband's death is pretty badass when she shoots an American helicopter down all by herself. There are always elements of propaganda in these movies, be it the sacrifice of individual Vietnamese people for the greater good of their country, or how they fend off a technologically advanced enemy like the US Army with very limited means. But these stories are also enjoyable because of the intimate portrayal of the characters. Vietnamese filmmakers took full advantage of what little they had, choosing to avoid portraying large-scale fights for the most part to focus on more personal stories was a successful strategy, and it can reach a wider audience in spite of the specificity and small scale of these films. The way movies can connect with us in such a personal way, no matter how distant their culture from our own, is the very reason I love cinema.